So here's a question I have about the two books metaphor. Just to play devil's advocate here, how do you?
I knew this was going to be dangerous with two historians.
So how do you find the balance? Because the two books metaphor is a very old idea, right? It's been used in the early church, but it was sort of changed the way it was interpreted, the way it was used in the early modern period. In the modern period, you have people like Francis Bacon and Galileo who used the two books metaphor, but they used it to separate the two books, to separate them, almost creating this kind of boundary, this infinite boundary between them, this huge gap between them. And because of that, what eventually happened with the metaphor, from I guess just the historical perspective, is that the two books ultimately collapsed into one book, and that's one book of nature. And you see that with people like the guys that I've studied, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White. They believed in the two books metaphor, but ultimately they interpreted it as one book, and that's the book of nature. So kind of nature, science ultimately trumps religion in the end. So how does one find the balancing both books? Just playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I find, I think it's John Wesley, it's one of the Wesley brothers, very helpful on this, just in, understanding there's multiple ways to come to know God, and nature, scripture, special revelation, but also experience is another way. And I think we need to be more vocal in the church to not let these narratives coming from culture, coming from science. I mean, a lot of that story, as I understand it, is science trying to gain kind of ground in culture and politics and gain influence in society. And so there was this push to try to make it all about science and understanding nature, and to lessen the influence of the church. And so I think the church needs to speak up and say, both of these, all of these are ways, because God created everything. God, we believe that God is sovereign over all. And so that includes our experience, that includes the natural world, that includes what happens in church and when we're in moments, sacred moments of prayer and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So James, you brought up White and his, he was the president of Cornell University, and wrote a famous book about the conflict of religion and science. So could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, when historians of science talk about the conflict thesis, they typically turn to these Anglo-American writers. They turn to this guy named John William Draper, and I have his book right here. Let me open it up to he wrote a book, The Conflict of Religion and History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and that was published in 1876, and he was a chemistry professor at New York University. And the other guy you mentioned was Andrew Dickson White, and he wrote a book, A History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom, and that was published in 1896, I believe. So according to historians of science, Draper and White kind of set the terms of the debate, and few people know about them today, but most who claim that there's a conflict between religion and science usually draws from like bits and pieces of the episodes or narratives in their books. So well, I agree with the whole debunking the conflict, debunking those episodes. I think that's something that's been done very well by people like Ted and John Brooke and my own PhD supervisor, Peter Harrison. They've done a fantastic job breaking down those myths of conflict between science and religion. I don't think that we have interpreted Draper and White correctly. I think they actually argued for a more nuanced position. For example, historians typically they argue that Draper was anti-Catholic, and that kind of spurred him to write a book as sort of an anti-Catholic diatribe. But really, at the time in America, almost everybody was anti-Catholic. So I don't think it really tells us much about Draper's view just to say he was anti-Catholic. Draper being anti-Catholic doesn't tell us much. And in terms of White, historians argue that his religious criticism of his university, Cornell University, kind of set him off. But White had already formulated his narrative and his views prior to founding Cornell University. He was actually teaching this narrative to undergraduate students at University of Michigan when he was a history professor there. So what's interesting about Draper's book is that The History of Conflict is a condensed version of a much larger book that he published in 1863. And that title was History of the Intellectual Development of Europe. And in that book, he makes this kind of crucial distinction between what he called religion and ecclesiastical organizations. And he's discussing the so-called paganization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine. But he made that distinction. He says that Christianity is a gift of God, whereas ecclesiastical institutions are a product of human invention. And because they're a product of human invention, they're open to criticism. And even as his History of Conflict, he makes this distinction between the extremist views. He says he's only going to argue against Orthodox Christianity or extreme Christianity and not the moderate ones. And he even closes his book talking about how Protestantism, at least his understanding of Protestantism, can become friends with science, can be reunited. And White was pretty much the same way. So what's happening with Draper and White, they're not atheists. They're not like the new atheists, but they had a kind of a nuanced understanding of Protestantism. And that understanding of Protestantism actually stems from kind of a more liberal Protestant background. So looking at the sort of development of theology is kind of very important to understanding how Draper and White argued, and which was ultimately the kind of the sad story is it's a story that unintended consequences is that this narrative was used at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century by this kind of new generation of secularists, free thinkers, atheists who used that narrative that was supposed to be attacking a certain segment of Protestantism, but it wasn't atheist. But this new generation was using that narrative, and they used it to attack all religion. So it kind of backfired on people like Draper and White and those people who supported Draper and White.
Isn't it true, though, James, that Draper and White themselves were very liberal religionists in a certain sense? They both rejected traditional Christianity as young people, as young men, and they thought that for them a sectarian faith would have meant basically the Apostles' and Nicene creeds. For them, that was sectarian religion, and that kind of religion for them just was not the future of America. America needed a religion that was much looser than that. So for White, it's kind of like the two great commandments of Christ, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, and love the Lord your God. But I know White closes the preface to his book, which is not in. I know you know the preface intimately, but it's surprising it's not in the edition you showed us, right? This Maslich's Cornell edition you held up. Preface isn't there. But at the end of the preface to that book, he says that the kind of religion he wants to have flow on pure and undefiled, as he puts it, is basically the religion in which, how's he put it? He quotes Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold saying that a power, not ourselves, which leads to righteousness. That's what he's interested in. It's kind of almost a transcendentalist view of religious faith. So it's not really Christianity in any traditional recognizable form, right? It's not traditional Christianity in any recognizable form. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. He doesn't believe in the incarnation. He doesn't believe in the deity of Jesus at all. So he's in no sense a traditional Christian, and he thinks that's all mumbo jumbo. And he thinks that, in fact, he calls it medieval dogmatism, where for him and many contemporaries, medieval was a pejorative. It wasn't a description of an historical period. It was a way of saying stupid and backward. And likewise, the noun dogmatism, he doesn't ever apply that to something like science. Heaven forbid. He applies the word dogmatism only to traditional Christian theology. So this is really an anti-traditional Christian view. It's not just anti-Catholic, of course, on Draper's part, but especially on White's part. It's just against traditional Christian belief. That's what it is. And he thinks that traditional Christian belief has always held back the progress of science. You know, he would have been
Yeah,
shocked to hear suggestions from somebody like Merton that the so-called Puritan ethos, you know, helps create scientific revolution. That's an unthinkable thought for someone like White.
Yeah, you know, and I say liberal Protestantism, but liberal Protestantism wasn't kind of a monolith. You know, there are different streams within it, and both Draper and White drew from different streams. You know, Draper drew from he wanted a return to a more rational Christianity, and this idea is very popular among 18th century rational Christians, people like John Locke and Francis Bacon and even Isaac Newton. They all had this kind of rational conception of what Christianity be. It's kind of simple, pure monotheism, whereas White drew from more contemporary reconceptualizations of religion. He's drawing from kind of the German mediating theology at the time. He actually spent a few years in Germany studying under these figures, and this idea is more of religion as something that's personal. It's religion that's something, it's about feelings and experience, and that because of that, scripture is not important. What's more important is this experience with God. So, and again, the two different streams within kind of Protestantism, or at least liberal Protestantism. And again, they did not deny the existence of God. They both believed the existence of God, but it was a God of their own making.
And this is, I think for me at least, in the work I do in the 20th century American religion and science, and looking at liberal Protestants and science in the period between the wars, which is an area that's really almost entirely unresearched. What I see is constant references, glowing references to White. The modern, so-called modernist Protestants who reject traditional.
Yeah.
So Ted, you look like you're frozen there.
Are you still there, Ted? Oh, we lost him. It was so great.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get him back.
Individuals just love White. They swallow him. And he says that White shows him that these traditional Christian beliefs, especially the inerrancy of the Bible, he mentions that, these are untenable beliefs. And he then turns his whole faith around and ends up in the course of his life basically rejecting almost all traditional understandings of Christianity. You know, this is Fosdick. This is not a minor voice. And it's because of White that he does this. And likewise, Conklin, whom I mentioned earlier, is one of the 3 people appointed to that committee to oppose Bryan. In the late 1890s, he was a lay Methodist preacher, as a very traditional Christian and a follower of Asa Gray in many ways. And then he reads White and Draper, and he says that they show him how the traditional Christian theology just can't be reconciled with science. You know, they're buying this great mythology in White and Draper as if it were established truth, and they're using it to guide their theological journeys. The modernist Christians in the 20th century substantially do exactly that. They build their theology with regard to science. They build their theology on the back of White and Draper. And to the extent that they do that, it's bankrupt. But that's what they're doing substantially. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the unappreciated lessons of your work, James, is that a lot of the modern so-called dialogue of science and religion that was dominated in the 60s and 70s by voices like Lady and Barber or the late Arthur Peacock, people like this in the English-speaking world, at least, Protestant. They were substantially disciples of White and Draper. They didn't agree with that. They wouldn't
without knowing it. Yeah,
they wouldn't have agreed with my analysis, but I think they were. They basically bought the warfare view of White and Draper. They bought the view that traditional Christian theology was not capable of a productive conversation with science, and you needed to move past it. You needed to move past it into either process theism or panentheism or something like that, while jettisoning the traditional view of creatio ex nihilo and other things that come along with it. I think that they really did swallow White and Draper whole and went on and did that.
Yeah. So quick question for you, Ted, about few people know this, but the Humanist Manifesto, which was published in the 1930s,
Right.
And it basically anti-religious, but what's interesting is that the first Humanist Manifesto was signed almost entirely by liberal Protestant ministers.
Correct.
There's not one scientist who signed the first version. I mean, later on,
the people who signed it was Edwin Arthur Burt, who was a great intellectual historian later at Columbia, who writes the book on the metaphysical foundations of modern science.
Yeah.
And he is in Chicago at the time. He's actually active in a Christian church. He's not really a Christian, but he's active in the Hyde Park Baptist Church, which is the church where Shaler Matthews, the great divinity school dean, is very active as a Sunday school teacher, and where what's his name? Gerald Burney Smith, very, very liberal Protestant theologian who loves white, just loves it and recommends it to preachers. He is very active there. And so is, for example, Arthur Holly Compton, famous Nobel laureate physicist. He's perhaps theologically the most conservative member I'm aware of at the church at the time. And he's not really a traditional Christian in many ways. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. But he does have a stronger, more robust doctrine of God, I think, than any of the other people that I mentioned. But Burt goes on to write a book about science and religion. And I think he's describing the atmosphere at Chicago and at the D School at Chicago, right when he's writing about this. And he talks about how all these beliefs get given up one after the other. So what's left? This is Burt observing all this. As you say, he signs the Humanist Manifesto. So this group in Chicago is really crucial because, of course, the seminary that we teach at is the largest Protestant seminary in the United States in terms of doctoral students. And they're sending their doctoral students all around the country, and they're giving them this white Draper warfare view of traditional theology and science. So I think the influence of these individuals is unappreciated in the 20th century conversation.
Yeah, and again, without really even knowing it, right? Because I think what's happened also is when historians of science in the 1980s started critiquing sort of so-called conflict thesis, they start misrepresenting what Draper and White were all about. But Draper and White were always part of this kind of liberal Protestant narrative, and places like the Chicago Divinity School are perpetuating this narrative without even knowing it. So it has many layers. The whole history of the conflict thesis has many layers, and it's great to hear that you're actually working on the 20th century aspect of it. Well,
I have a book that I have to get back to working on. It's under contract with Johns Hopkins to explain this idea to people. But it's based on primary documents in the sense that it's an edition. It's an edition of rare pamphlets about science and religion by a Chicago-centered group that featured Compton and Robert Millikan and several other prominent American scientists, along with some of these clergy like Matthews and Fosdick, who contributed to these. And Langdon Gilkey's father, Charles Gilkey, who was the first chaplain at the Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago. So these are the kinds of individuals that kind of brought this together. The Chicago, if you will, Chicago style, science and religion, Chicago style.
Yeah, right. I mean, philosopher John Dewey also signed the Humanist Manifesto later on, and he, in his philosophy courses, history philosophy courses, he's perpetuating this kind of simplistic conflict thesis as well. So yeah.
Oh, this takes over American universities and seminaries, mainline seminaries, for a long time. This narrative of the inevitable conflict of science and religion. The ideas that get worked on today in the history of science and religion won't look anything like this. But the idea, for example, that maybe Johannes Kepler's encounter with Trinitarian Lutheranism influences him to become a Copernican, that would have been an unthinkable thought for both Draper and White. The idea that theology might have had anything at all positive to do with the development of science. You know, that's verboten to think that way for Draper and White. Let me show people something. Let me go find something and come right back. A picture that I think people would really like to see.
So let's see. I may have to make you a co-host or something if I can.
Okay. Okay. I'll go look for the picture. I'll go look for the picture, and you look for that.
Okay. So I made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. If
Okay.
so, at any rate, while you're looking for that,
I found the picture. So okay, I've got the picture. So let me come back into Zoom here and show people to sort of pictorially represent what James and I have been talking about. There it is.
All right, it worked.
There it is.
You got it.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, so this comes from this is from the Library of Congress. It's in an issue of a magazine called Puck. It's the name of the magazine, published in the late 19th century by a German American named Udo Kepler, okay, with 2 P's.
Same artist, incidentally, who painted.
Did that one, the cover on your book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this guy did a lot of cool stuff in the late 19th century, a lot of warfare. So you can see this is The Last Stand, Science versus Superstition. This is 3 years after White's book. And you have the clergy coming out of the castle of medieval dogmatism, a term that comes straight from White. And here they're under the banner of believe or be damned. And of course, they're carrying medieval weapons. And over here on this side, firing the Gatling gun. This is actually Felix Adler, the very liberal Jewish thinker, who is the founder of the ethical culture school in New York, and that whole movement. And he's firing a gun that says history, archaeology, evolution, and enlightenment are these barrels. And that's, I think, that's geology. And they're firing at these guys. And here's the, you can see the ammunition is rational religion, historical facts, scientific facts, think or be damned. And the light, of course, from their side, is illuminating the darkness over here. So this is really how so-called progressives, with the exception of someone like William Jennings Bryan, this is how so-called progressives 125 years ago viewed the story of science and religion. This was it. This was dogmatism, medieval dogmatism being overcome by progressive scientific truth. And that's what the narrative of science and religion was all about in America at the turn of the century.
Great.
But again, they're not criticizing religion, right? They're redefining what religion is, but the critique is against dogmatic theology, right?
It's against medieval dogmatism. From White, it is all over the place. Medieval dogmatism, it means the Nicene Creed and the Apostles'. That's what it means. In context, that's what it means. It means if you think those things are true, you think the Bible teaches, that the Christian tradition teaches correctly those things, that's the dogmatism that science overturns in their view.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, let me just invite, if anybody has a question and you'd like to unmute yourself, I think you can just unmute yourself, or you can type your question in the chat. But I really, I wanted to thank Beatrice, who reminded me to turn on the recording. So I really thank you very much for that. But anyone, please feel free to ask questions. I wanted to ask you, Drew, what are the kinds of questions that come up most frequently in science for the church? What are Christians what are they struggling with in terms of trying to put science and faith together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really varies depending on where they are and the context. Of course, right now, a lot are struggling with various aspects of the pandemic. And do we take a vaccine? How do we understand this virus? I think it's been a real challenge for people because we've seen science kind of do its thing in real time as it tries to figure out what we can use to prevent this virus. So we get these changing ideas of we can gather, we can't gather, wear a face mask, don't wear a face mask. All of that is because science is working in real time, trying to understand how this virus works and how it transmits and what's the best way to prevent it. So I think that's a huge one that's dominated the conversation right now. I think that, this kind of conflict warfare thesis is always in the background, whether people acknowledge it or not. It's always kind of just below the surface. Certainly evolution, climate change, caring for the environment, creation care. But a lot of it depends on, which church audience you're talking to. A mainline audience is very, very different than a conservative evangelical. In the mainline, a lot of folks say, I accept evolution. Why do we need to talk about science anymore? Where in a more conservative tradition, that there's often a real felt tension around that. So, one thing it's one of the reasons I really value the historical work, particularly some of the things I know that Ted has done. Something that I think is really helpful for the church is to see the real examples of people of faith trying to live out their life in science. And of course, there's contemporary examples. This conference is filled with them, but there's also these historical figures that Ted and James and many other people highlight to us. And their stories are always complicated. They're people like us that we're trying to make sense of the Christian faith. We're trying to wrestle with some of the orthodox beliefs. Do I believe in this? Do I not? They struggle with doubt. They're trying to make it in the scientific world. They're facing the challenges of trying to understand the natural world. And there's some beautiful stories there. I'm not going to pretend to tell them as the non-historian on this panel, but people talking about the scientific discovery and comparing it to worship, and people coming to deeper faith through the kind of awe and the mystery that their scientific work invokes, and those aha moments of discovery. And now I've learned something about what God knew all along in creating the universe. I think those stories are powerful, and I think again, as I said at the very beginning, and talking about the work of Science for the Church, helping contemporary scientists that are working through those things actively as part of their faith, giving them voice in the church, I think is really, really powerful. And we say at Science for the Church, our mission statement is that the engaging science can actually strengthen the church. And I think part of the way it can do that is raising these voices of scientists and their experiences, their wrestling, their discoveries, letting them enrich our corporate life together as Christians.
Great, thank you so much. So we have been getting some questions, and Daniel has brought in some questions from Huva that have been asked. So the first one is, could you expand on how racism has been involved in the history of religion and science? So you started talking about that, Ted, with the question of evolution. If you want to add on to that, and then maybe James or Drew, if you'd like to tackle it.
Well, this is not a topic that I write generally about very much. Others probably have. The example in which the context in which I had raised this issue of scientific racism was in connection with the Scopes trial. And that's because for a long time, for I don't know, several decades, evolution was assumed by many scientists to imply or be supportive of the view that white people are racially superior to everyone else, and it is often, well, again, I'll show a picture. Let me go find it. It won't take long now.
It's a real treat to see Ted's archive of pictures whenever I'm with him.
I'm a big fan of using images. When I decided to go to grad school, the debate was between art history or science for me. Okay, here we go. And this is directly related to the Scopes trial. This was published in an article by Henry Fairfield Osborne, one of the three guys I mentioned who's appointed by the class to oppose Brian. It's from an article in a popular magazine called The Forum. I think it's the year after the Scopes trial. The article is called Facts of the Evolutionists. That's what it is, plural, Facts of the Evolutionists, name of the article. Brian, remember, had attacked the factual basis of evolution. He said evolution is not a fact. And Osborne wanted to respond to Bryan by basically saying evolution is fact, and here's the facts that it is, okay? And here is the existing facts of human ascent. You can see for yourself, okay? This is what evolution meant to someone like Henry Fairfield Osborne here in the 1920s. So this is just an example here of how race impinges on this idea of what evolution means and how it relates to religion. Osborne would have viewed himself as a Christian, a very liberal. I don't know what church he belonged to. He was a Presbyterian, but I'm not sure about that. I'd have to research that. It wouldn't be hard to find that out. But he was, one of the top scientific people of his day and one of the big voices against Bryan. He was one of the right popular responses to William Jennings Bryan's efforts to shut down evolution. So it bears on this issue that way. But the larger question Daniel rightly asks, that I expand on how racism has been involved in history of religion and science, that one is one I haven't thought about very much in the broader way. I've really thought about it only in this narrower context.
Yeah. Like Ted, I haven't really studied the history of racism. I've read a few books, so I have a couple of book recommendations here. There's this one book recently read by Nathan Alexander, Race in a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914. And Nathan does a fantastic job tracing the origins of racism or scientific racism to atheists, interestingly, and also to kind of the more liberal Protestant stream. Draper was a racist. I'm pretty sure White might have been one as well. And this is something that I've recently discovered myself, is John Tindall, the famous English physicist, was also a racist. There's an issue that came up and he wanted to join a project that was really racist. And Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, was a little bit more progressive and tried to encourage him not to do it. But John Tyndall put his fame and his authority behind the project, and it was a racist project. Another book on the topic is The Scientific Spirit of American Humanism by Stephen Weldon. Good book. He also has a couple of chapters looking at how secular humanism in the early 20th century also promoted certain racist ideas. So it has a very long, ugly history. I mean, if you look back at some of the Enlightenment figures, the French philosophes, and even on the English side as well, they believe that something called phrenology and how a head is structured or the color of a skin indicated certain levels of superiority, and they based this on scientific facts. So hence the phrase scientific racism. So they believed they were being scientific in their racist views. And interestingly enough, a lot of people in the church, a bit more conservative, more Orthodox Christians, rejected this idea, and they were labeled as anti-scientific by these figures. So they rejected these ideas of racism, and their opponent accused them of being anti-scientific because of it.
I'm writing a reply to an interesting comment right now in the chat that Stephen put out there. I'm just going to reply and let others go ahead and speak.
Okay, so another question that we got some great questions in the chat. So another question is about revisionist history. That it was mentioned that people use revisionist history incorrectly. Could you go into more depth into that concept of why revisionist history is often coined incorrectly and the dangers of going back, and instead of a revision of history, the attempt is made to rewrite the event? So any
Ted, what did you mean about that? What do you mean about revisionist history?
Okay, I was thinking specifically of how the political right today is often using the term revisionist to mean people who challenge old-fashioned views of American history. So it has a narrow meaning, and it must be the left doing that. As they use this term, revisionist, and revisionist takes on a meaning of, bad guys are the ones who want to do that, who want to rewrite the history textbooks, as if the rewriting of history isn't what historians normally do, regardless of political strife. And so what I wanted to say is that in terms of the history of science and Christianity, which is what the field I work in, I'm a revisionist. I want to rewrite that established history of Christianity and science.
Yeah.
And I don't think that people who find cause to use the word revisionist as an epithet to throw at some American historians would be inclined to throw it at me, because I'm actually defending many of their traditional values when I do this. But the fact is, I'm a revisionist as a historian. I think the received narrative of the history of science and Christianity is just basically garbage. It's the white draper narrative. I'm not just saying this because of my own particular viewpoints. I think nearly every historian of science would agree fully with what I just said. It's just garbage. And I'm looking to reconstruct that narrative, rewrite the narrative of Christianity and science, do it more reliably, more accurately, historically, and it's going to be friendlier to people of faith when you do that, because the narrative you're getting rid of is a rotten narrative, very unfriendly to Christians and academia.
Great. And someone writes, is the way to change the church culture to partner with seminaries so that graduating ministers and pastors are more supportive of science? And Drew, maybe you'd like to take that one.
Sure. So, I mean, there is an effort. There's a major program right now that has funded in the ballpark of 30 different seminaries to incorporate science in the required coursework of seminaries. It's called Science for Seminaries. It's hosted out of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So this is absolutely an effort that's underway. Even before it happened, I trained at a seminary, Princeton Seminary, that had a theology and science professor. He was not alone. There's folks at many other seminaries that are doing this work. How much it's actually impacting pastors, I think, is an open question. When you have a weak module in Old Testament 101 that talks about Genesis and the Big Bang, how much does that change how a pastor engages science when they're hanging out with medical doctors or engineers or others? It's not entirely clear, but there's certainly an effort to try to, at least question the reception of things like the warfare thesis, the conflict narrative, and to begin to see the value of science and bringing that into the church. So yeah, I think there's definitely work to be done there. And I think it's ongoing work too, because this is hard. I love listening to James and Ted get into the details and tell us how complex stuff is. But pastors don't have the capacity to go into that level of depth and to share that with their congregations. How do you come up with some of the summary statements, some of the catchy anecdotes that can begin to change the narratives in the church is I think a lot of what needs to happen. And yeah, I'm hoping some of the work at the seminaries can do that. I'm hoping some of the work many organizations, including Science for the Church, are doing can begin to change that.
So Adriana has a very interesting question about Nietzsche. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Nietzsche coined the idea that God is dead. We have killed him as a result of the Enlightenment movement. Is that a fair addition to this conversation? For his idea was born out of the growth of the scientific community and the belief that science has the ability to answer all questions, and therefore the need for God was no more, for we'd outgrown the need to have a supreme deity as the umbrella through which things were explained. So anybody want to tackle Nietzsche?
It's interesting because he made that criticism, or he made that claim, not because of science, but because he felt like society, almost like Kierkegaard in a way, he felt like society that pretended to be Christian. They're living a certain way, they're acting a certain way, and they're believing a certain way, which is actually quite atheistic. And that's why he said God is dead. We have killed him because we are pretending like he exists, but people don't actually live like he actually exists. That's how I understand what Nietzsche was doing in that passage. I could be wrong. I'm not a philosopher, so.
Well, it's a great question. He's certainly a very interesting figure. I think he's more of a poet, actually, rather than a scientist. You know, he writes about, you know, the Dionysiac. There's something very not, you know, abandoning rationality, or rather, you know, leaping from rationality in Nietzsche. But he's certainly a very creative figure who's very, very influential. So great question, Adriana. So moving on, I don't really know how much time we have, but let's march on. So Mark writes, during this discussion, we've learned that conflict theorists make fine distinctions regarding what religions are. Wouldn't it be useful to make distinctions as regard to what science is? The distinction between science and scientism is crucial. So it's crucially important. And what about the difference between natural science, where truth is the objective, and the expressions of social science, where truth has been set aside in favor of liberation and the distribution of power, as seen in the Frankfurt School? Making definitions of what science is and what religion is. Does anyone want to? We've touched on that in some ways, in talking about how white had a different kind of religion, you know, sort of redefining religion. But any thoughts about that?
Well, there's a sociologist of science, Christopher Toomey, who he and I go back a long way. And about 35 years ago, he wrote a conference paper about science and religion that he called "Undressing Two Transvestites," because science likes to dress itself up as religion, and religion likes to dress itself up as science. I thought that was a really clever way of putting things. That you know, science can stray over into human values and try to provide them for us. And Stephen Jay Gould, as pointed out by Stephen Rich here today in the comments, was really good at detecting this type of thing. And scientific racism is a prominent example of that. Eugenics is another prominent example of that. And when science tries to dictate to us what our values should be, and it's religion, of course, is good at this too, at dressing it up. And scientific creationism is a nice example of that. A kind of religion passing itself off as science, when of course it's not. But this is one reason why the game is not that simple. Sometimes it's, you know, the Supreme Court definition of pornography, that you know it when you see it. This is the type of thing. You know religion when you see it. You know science when you see it. That's really hard. Karl Popper tried formally to separate science and metaphysics, and most philosophers of science, I think, you can't put very easily. Science and non-science are really hard to discriminate.
Yeah, certainly as somebody who teaches in a religious studies faculty, I can tell you that for the last, I would say 30 years, people have been debating this question about whether religion can actually be defined or not. And then if you feel like you can define something, provide a universal definition, then what should it be? But there is actually a large movement that would say, of scholars would say, that religion actually can't be defined in any valid way. So that's a great, you're asking a really great question and thinking about this, these issues. So I think we've got all the questions maybe in the chat. Maybe I missed one. Does anyone have a question? If you'd like to have we're supposed to start concluding comments, Daniel tells me, at 3:45, which is 2 minutes. So, if anyone would like to unmute themselves, or if I missed a question in the chat, just feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, the concluding comments are back with all COFAS. So we've got to finish up. Oh, I see. All right. Well. So thank you very much. I guess we should end this then, since we've got to go back to the plenary session. And I just want to thank you very, very much, all three of you, and for our wonderful visitors, both our visiting speakers and those who've attended. And welcome. Just enjoy the conference, and I look forward to talking to you further.